My team made a dash and grabbed them and started running backwards. And I forsook my post, and instead of running backwards with them, I made a dive for the gondola because I wanted to get my hands on it. I wanted to be right there to get a grip on the actual airship itself. That's what I wanted. I found a spot there, grabbed the rails, and it turned out to be exactly under the window that Dr. Hugo Echner, the commander, used to lean out to sign autographs, to talk to reporters and everything else. You realise when you were looking at him, you were looking at the brains behind the Zeppelin. You were like a god to me looking up at him. There he was in command of a Zeppelin, a thing like that. Oh, terrific.
The Zeppelin Company passed into state control under Hitler, but not Hugo Echner.
Hitler didn't dare to touch Dr. Echner because Dr. Echner was so well known internationally. They held parades in honor of Hitler, and Dr. Echner would walk in the parade, but he refused to say Heil Hitler. And Dr. Echner refused to knuckle down to Hitler.
Nazi money completed Germany's greatest airship, the Hindenburg. Echner had hoped to use helium, a non-inflammable gas, but America had a monopoly on it.
Because of Hitler, our government refused to give helium to Germany, and I'm sure it came from the very highest places. The president himself. Nothing would have ever happened to it if it had been filled with helium. Every time the Hindenburg would land from Germany, why, there'd be a flock of reporters and photographers come down from New York to witness this thing.
I enjoyed the trip tremendously. It was a real revelation. I realized that at last the commercial airship flying across the Atlantic can mean something.
We had a wonderful flight in a record time of about 50 hours from coast to coast. That is nearly half the time the fastest steamers need. I admit we had to make the flight under very favorable weather conditions, but I am convinced under all weather conditions, even on the most unfavorable, we will be able to make the flight in all regularity and safety. Thank you. Thank you very much, Doctor.
In 1937, the future of the Hindenburg looked promising. It was the last word in luxury, and Germany was the only country operating passenger services across the Atlantic. Until May of that year.
It's practically standing still now. They've dropped ropes out of the nose of the ship, and it's been taken a hold of down on the field by a number of men. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it. It bursts into flames. Wait, get it started. It's fighting, and it's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks between us. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I told you. Never talk to people whose friends are on there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just laying down massive smoking wreckage.
There had been so many deaths, culminating in the disasters of the R-101 and the Hindenburg, that for many years passenger-carrying airships disappeared from the sky. Today, small helium-filled dirigibles are a familiar sight over many cities. Larger airships could one day provide surveillance platforms high above the Earth's surface as part of a country's strategic defenses. In the 1930s, the balloon was being rediscovered as a means of exploring the atmosphere. Auguste Piccard, a Swiss physicist, built a pressurized gondola. In 1931, he flew to 51,700 feet in the stratosphere and set a new world record. Like Coxwell and Glacier 70 years before him, it was an adventure. He stayed up overnight before landing on a glacier in the Alps. He broke his own record the following year and brought back information about the nature of cosmic rays and became an international celebrity. High-altitude ballooning in pressurized gondolas became an international endeavor. A race developed between the Soviet Union and the United States to set ever higher records. In 1933, Soviet balloonists set a new world record of 58,000 feet. America responded 2 months later with 61,000 feet. On the next Soviet flight, all 3 balloonists died when their gondola broke free and fell to Earth. The climax to the rivalry came in 1935, when 2 American military balloonists, Captain Orville Anderson and Captain Albert Stevens, set a new record of 72,000 feet. Their achievement was to endure until after the Second World War. In the 1950s, the stakes were even higher. The race was to get a man into space.
We didn't know just how to select a man to go into space. We also knew that when man go into space, that he'd have to have a pressure suit. We'd never had any real long-term exposure in a pressure suit. We also had very little experience on the selection of the atmosphere that we would want to breathe.
A great deal of research could be done in aircraft which could be flown to simulate weightlessness. But there were some tests which could only be done at very high altitudes using balloons.
We knew that when we go into space, that man was going to be getting outside of the capsule. We knew that he was going to walk into space. He was going to walk on the moon. We had never, ever done this. We had never, ever been outside of a spacecraft or anything with no pressure. And of course, the other objective was that once he got there, how to provide a means of escape, how to get back to the Earth in the event of a catastrophe at high altitude.
There would have to be an ultimate test.
I knew that if anything went wrong with that pressure suit, that I was dead.
Weighed down by his suit, a parachute, a film camera on his back, and breathing apparatus, Joe Kittinger was to ride an open balloon capsule to more than 100,000 feet and at the exact moment jump out.
The reason why we were there was because it was a balloon. There was no aircraft that would get us up to those altitudes to do these tests. And without a balloon, we couldn't have done it.
The balloon would rise almost to the edge of space, expanding as the atmosphere grew thinner.
I had to stay there for about 11 minutes while the balloon drifted over the exact spot that I wanted to drop. I had about 45 items that I had to go through on my checklist in order to separate from the capsule. I disconnect my kit from the oxygen equipment on the capsule. So I severed the umbilical cord before I jumped out. And it was a moment of truth. That was why I was there. So I was really kind of elated when it was time to go. And I started falling, and I was falling very rapidly. And I kept accelerating and accelerating until I was faster than the speed of sound without an airplane at about 90,000 feet. But I fell into the Earth's atmosphere, got more dense, and I kept slowing down. When the parachute opened, the opening shock was relief because the experiment was over as far as I'm concerned.
Joe Kittinger jumped from 102,000 feet, almost 20 miles high, a record for a parachute jump, and likely to remain so for a long time. The contribution made by Joe Kittinger and his fellow balloonists to the United States space program ended in 1961 when the altitude record was set at 113,000 feet, testing suits for Mercury astronauts. That record still stands. Ballooning still attracts those whose sole purpose is the search for adventure. In 1987, Richard Branson built a hot air balloon to fly the Atlantic.
We're going to give it a damn good try.
The dream of crossing the Atlantic by balloon was almost as old as ballooning itself. But it had taken until 1978 for that dream to be realized by 3 Americans using a helium-filled balloon. The winds were the same, but the technology had changed. Branson used modern fabrics, gas burners, and radio.
It's not over yet. We've got the worst task ahead of us. Atlantic.
But you must have some sense of relief that you're over the big pond, anyway.
There's no doubt about that.
He touched down briefly in Northern Ireland, losing more of his gas supply. But he pressed on, trying to make his final landfall on the mainland of Britain. It was not to be. Virgin Atlantic drifted gently into the sea between Ireland and Scotland. Branson and his pilot, Per Lindstrand, had to be rescued by very modern methods.
Nita, I'm going to punch these 2 out of here.
Modern technology has made hot air ballooning a safer sport for all. Today, many thousands of people are able to enjoy the serenity, the adventure, and the mystery of the oldest form of manned flight. After 200 years, balloons still have the ability to draw a crowd and turn heads. Advertisers recognize this age-old quality in balloons. They've sponsored a wide variety of shapes and sizes, which would have been a strange sight in the days of the Montgolfier brothers. Today's balloonists, like Joe Kittinger, freely acknowledge the debt they owe to those pioneers.
The early pioneers in ballooning took risk every time they flew. They had no knowledge, they had no background, they had no one who had preceded them. The debt that balloonists have to Rozier and Charles and Blanchard is the same debt that aviators have to the Wright brothers. They built the steps that we lived on, that we gained the knowledge from what the advances that they made.
he never sent up the process, he never made fun or light of it. And he was always, you know, there. I don't quite know what the bottom of that story is. It's like Bottom's dream, it hath no bottom.
The Theatre of Comedy has launched a trust in Roy Kinnear's name to endow a scholarship at RADA. For further information about this, please write to the Roy Kinnear Trust, Criterion Theatre, Piccadilly, London W1V 9LB. Tonight's new Australian movie is Fran, a sensitive drama about a caring yet irresponsible young mother.
Every time I turn around, you're there, waiting for me.
Oh, geez, you've never got a good thing to say about any man.
I just don't see why you always bend over backwards for them.
They won't stay if you don't. When you grow up, don't you let men get you into so much trouble. You don't want to end up like your mum.
Fran, the new Australian movie, tonight at 9 on 2. And between now and then, here on 2, we continue our series on the history of flight with The Bombers, Reaching for the Skies.
340 knots.
All the missiles have been pre-armed. Special weapons lock indicator.
Indicator unlocked.
RCD. Stand by for missile launch.
8 years after the Wright brothers first flew, an aeroplane dropped a bomb.
Radar's on his offset. 10, 9.
Within 40 years, an aircraft could destroy a city.
3, 2, 1. Missile away.
Now, it can lay waste a country. This awesome aeroplane is the American B-52, B for bomber, the 52nd since the United States commissioned its first in World War I. The deadliest aircraft in history, it can carry 40 tons of conventional bombs or a 15-megaton nuclear device. It can circle the Earth, the supreme embodiment of air power, the strategic bomber. Bombers have brought a new and horrific dimension to warfare, annihilating people, demolishing cities, obliterating landscapes. Conventional bombing reached its climax in the war in Vietnam. In a 10-year campaign, the United States dropped over 6.5 million tons of bombs, more than was used in the whole of World War II. Every type of bomb was used, every type of bomber flown. The fighter bomber, called up by radio in support of the troops on the ground, and dropping its napalm just yards away from its own GIs. the medium-range bomber, sent in to destroy the enemy's communications and supply lines using the pinpoint accuracy of laser-guided bombs to hit its targets. Most terrible of all, the strategic bomber, the B-52 itself. Summoned from thousands of miles away, it rained destruction on economic targets deep in the heartland of North Vietnam. The effect of such a bombing on his victims was shattering.
We had surrendered to us an NVA soldier. We hadn't been standing there watching him in the trench more than a couple of minutes before one of our own jet aircraft flew over at some distance from the hill, whereupon this man literally dissolved into shaking and uncontrolled reaction to just the sound of that jet going overhead. We found that, for instance, if we simply clapped our hands, the man would defecate standing there. He was psychologically destroyed by the constant heavy bombing.
Just 30 years separated Vietnam from the war that first experienced the full impact of strategic bombing. It was 1936 in the Spanish Civil War, and it was the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, which demonstrated the power of the bomber as a weapon of terror on civilian targets. On August the 14th, 1936, the Luftwaffe launched a series of air raids that would change the face of warfare. Spanish cities held by the Republicans were to be the testing ground for this new kind of offensive. Madrid, the first target. But the climax came 8 months later with the destruction of the undefended town of Guernica. More than 1,500 people were killed in the bombing. The air raids sent shockwaves around the world. A devastating and, it seemed, irresistible way of waging war had arrived. The Germans now unleashed another military revolution, Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. It integrated troops, tanks, and aircraft in one combined assault. Here was a new job for the bomber, to support the soldiers as they advanced. Enter the Stuka, a dive bomber, whose shriek could chill the bravest heart.
And in the Blitz war, troops must be moving. And the armed spearheads, if they run into an obstacle which they couldn't overcome, then the Air Force had to send a squadron or a group of Stukas. For this reason, in the first armed cars was always a Stuka pilot as a connection officer. And he was in radio contact with the leader of the Stuka group which attacked. By this contact, it was possible to drop bombs sometimes nearer than 100 meters in front of their own troops. I think you have to be cool to do it. And if you cannot be cool under these conditions, you might be a nice fellow, a good pilot otherwise, but not for this special job. When you start the dive, for a young fellow, the whole world belongs to you. It's really an amazing feeling. You dive with a speed of 450 kilometers. Then you have to keep the aircraft straight, clean for 3 seconds. You have a horn like in the car. It gives exactly the height where you pull out. And we have switched it, let's say, to 2,000 feet. And it yells. Then first you drop the bomb and pull out. As soon as you are level, of course, you apply full power because now you run for life.
As the German armies launched their invasions, Guernica was repeated across Europe. In one devastating air raid, the center of Rotterdam was flattened. 5 hours later, the Dutch government surrendered. It was the bombers' moment of triumph. It seemed now nothing could stop it. All that lay between the conquering German armies and complete victory in Europe was Britain. Hitler gave Goering and his Luftwaffe a new job, to prepare the way for an invasion across the English Channel. What he needed now was not an air force in support of the army, but one that could seek out and destroy key strategic targets in Britain. The mainstay of this air assault was the bomber that had proved itself in Spain, the Heinkel 111. Small by later standards, it had a crew of 4, carried 2 tons of bombs, and could fly a round trip of 500 miles. By the end of the war, over 6,500 of these aircraft had flown with the Luftwaffe.
Die 111 war für uns alle, für jede Besatzung.
The Heinkel 111 was for all of us, every crew that flew it, a kind of life insurance. The machine was reliable, good-tempered, was easy to fly. Anyone else in a Junkers 88, for example, or any other more complicated plane, would have had more worries than we did in a Heinkel 111. Everyone knew it was a serious business, and the tension increased the moment we reached the Channel coast. The nearer we got to the English mainland, the higher the tension became. No one spoke much. One simply said, right, 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 or left, left, left. Hold steady. Now I'm ready.
The Luftwaffe assault on England began in July of 1940. Its first targets were the RAF's airfields. Its aims, to deprive the British of their main line of defense against the bombers. But the German Air Force now faced a new experience. Far from their bases, they came up against defended targets. For the first time, bombers confronted the determined resistance of fighters. So the Battle of Britain began. The British now introduced a new defensive weapon into the battle, radar, a device which, by transmitting radio waves and picking up their echoes, could detect solid objects at a distance. With radar and other electronic developments, the British defenders could work out the location, numbers and range of the approaching bombers. They could then scramble their fighters at the most effective moment. daylight, the German bombers suffered enormous losses. By the summer's end, they had still not broken the British defences. The bomber had received its first setback. So Goering changed the tactics. Now the Luftwaffe would raid by night. Darkness offered greater security to the vulnerable bombers. But darkness brought problems too. How do you find a blacked-out target at night over a strange country? The Germans developed an electronic system of their own. 2 converging radio beams that told the pilot when he was over the target. But the British countered with a device which bent the beams.
Suddenly we couldn't hear the beam anymore, and when it came back, we found we were 17 degrees off course. We couldn't find Derby or our alternative target, so we decided to fly home. We dropped our bombs in the channel. Landing with bombs is no life insurance. And so the whole raid, as it is so beautifully put in airman's jargon, has gone down the trousers, was a washout.
On September the 7th, the attacks on Britain's capital began. At its height, the Blitz raged for 76 nights, but it failed to break the people's spirit. The bomber had suffered another setback, as American correspondent Quentin Reynolds told the world.
From the clouds, hell was let loose. I saw the magnificent work of your grand firemen and ARP people. All honor to them. As the flames roared, Londoners set their teeth and took it on the chin. But it wasn't a knockout. It gave birth to a grim determination that the Germans should pay dearly for such destruction.
Britain's only means of hitting back was to launch its own bomber offensive. The greatest advocate of this policy was Chief of the RAF's Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and 100 other places, they put that rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
The Lancaster was the British bomber that took the offensive back to the Third Reich. It had a crew of 6 or 7 and was armed with 8 guns. With a bomb load of 10 tons, it could fly deep into Germany and back. The RAF had learned from bloody experience how vulnerable lightly armed bombers were. So the Lancaster bristled with a formidable armory, designed to beat off the German fighters and batter through the German defenses.
When the Lancaster came along, you felt that at least you were going to survive and also be effective against the enemy. You had this backfiring of the exhaust, the bang-bang of the thing as it turned over, and then this enormous surge of power as it picked up. You did this 4 times, and each time the engines picked up, you know, the extra crescendo of noise, the vibration increased until the whole aircraft was shaking. The thing began to gather speed, and the whole thing was absolutely vibrating with power. If you put your hand on the metal, it felt as if it was hot. It was zinging. 2,000 horsepower practically in each engine. That's the sort of power that's running through the frame. And you knew you had to get everything out of the aircraft to get it over the end and up into the air. Because we had such tremendous loads. We took 14,000 pounds of bombs to Berlin.
The Lancaster of the heavy bombers was the winner for Britain. She was a gentle aircraft, she had plenty of latitude, you could throw her about. She was the ideal heavy bomber.
But tough as the Lancaster was, beyond the protection of short-range fighters, it was still vulnerable.
We tried bombing in daylight, and it was impossible. You couldn't get through the fighter defenses. It was suicidal. We had to bomb at night. And the moment you bomb at night, you lost your accuracy. So there came the moment when either we stopped the offensive or went to area bombing.
Area bombing meant bombing whole cities rather than specific targets, a controversial policy after the war. But for the British people in their darkest hour, the only way to strike back, a fitting revenge for the Blitz. For the young air crews, flying bombing missions over Europe was a deadly dangerous job. In the whole of the war, only German U-boat crews faced greater risk to their survival.
The tour of operations was 30. The squadron I was with had first Wellingtons, then Lancasters, and we were operating anything from 20 to 25 aircraft a night. In something like 14 months, I don't suppose I saw more than about a dozen crews finish a tour and go off. So the expectation of life was not high. Now, to keep on in that knowledge, I always found to be quite extraordinary. We're losing up to 80 or sometimes 90 aircraft a night from the command, getting fairly close to the 10% attrition rate, which is regarded as uneconomical. And although it improved later, nevertheless, it was a pretty harsh prospect. We had no means of knowing at that time what happened to aircraft and crews. They just disappeared. Some of them became prisoners, but as far as we were concerned, they'd gone.
They used to have a briefing a few hours before the takeoff time. There used to be a screen at the end of the hut, curtained, and when the commanding officer came in, he used to say, "Right, lads, this is where it is tonight." He'd pull the string, the curtain would open, and then on the wall there was a huge big map of Europe with a red ribbon going from your base to wherever the target was. And we all used to look, first of all, where the end of the red ribbon was, and if it was Berlin, we all used to say, "Oh my God, not again."
The thing which used to impress me about so many of these young pilots flying a 4-engine airplane, they couldn't drive a car because they weren't old enough to get a license when the war started. They could fly a bomber, but they couldn't drive a car.
You had your own ground crew. They attached themselves to you and you to them because you depended on them for your life. And they were all sensing that you were going out and they were behind. But you felt that you were all one because you did the same thing. You came together on that dispersal. And in the fading light, this was the last moment, possibly some of us would see them again. We got into the aircraft. The rear gunner was going to his outpost in the rear end, and it was uphill gradient to the cockpit, and the rest of us were climbing over the big central main beam of the main plane, and this was a sort of grand national hurdle because by this time you were getting a bit tired, if you like, of the physical effort, and I suppose the mental block that really this is not the place for you.
once you'd gone into the sky, you were virtually on your own. It was dark. We didn't have navigation lights. Quite often, the only reason you'd know there was another aircraft there was when you'd get a bump as you crossed the slipstream of another aircraft. But you probably wouldn't see it. You were virtually on your own. It was an individual effort.
Every aircraft had its own smell, and I can smell it now, a mixture of high-octane fuel, hydraulic fluid, rubber, even the Elson giving off smells. You know, they had a chemical Elson in the back. It also, I think, a mixture of fear, you know, at the same time.
They took flasks of coffee and tea. They also had flying rations, so-called chocolate, which was precious, chewing gum, wine gums, and things of that sort. And they would very often use these to pace out the flight.
You could see growing on the horizon this big cauldron of light, with lights flashing, intense white light of the buildings burning, the splash of the incendiaries going down, the pinpoint of lights which were denoting bombs going off, and the constant flash of the anti-aircraft fire. So you got this effect of terrific pyrotechnic display, which was silent. It's like very slow film being unrolled beneath you. The whole thing doesn't seem to be getting closer. You think, by God, for God's sake, we're sitting here. And you're waiting to get those bomb doors open to get rid of the load and pull up and pull out. So you're just sitting there like a big goose for the fighter to pick you off. The only feeling that you've got is you're in the herd and you hope somebody on the outside of the herd is going to get picked off and it's not you, so they might be satisfied.
You see people opening the bomb doors, and you see people in front, their bombs leaving. The load of incendiaries, which are carried in a long container in the bomb bay, tumble in there like matchsticks. When they strike the ground, they're an intense fire which is difficult to put out. If it's a blockbuster, you can see a big red ball of fire, wells up and dies down. When you press a button, you get a feeling of elation. You feel, this is where you're getting over. You're going to hit them.
You feel the bump as each bomb goes. If it's a big one, 4,000 pounder, you can thump. You can feel the release through the seat of your pants. And the aircraft is no longer sluggish, but it's more alive. And you just couldn't get those doors closed quick enough and go into a nose-down position where you got extra speed and pulled away from the target. It was a great feeling to cross that coast, and you could see the friendly fields and hedges if it was coming dawn, and the familiar approaches to the airfield. And as you were approaching, you could hear the girl in the tower, and you called her up, and you got the acknowledgement. And it could possibly be the girl that you dated the night before. But you have a sense of well-being, or homecoming, if you like. They had petrol flares if it was very misty, big tallow oil cans. It looked like Dante's Inferno with these long streamers of flame going up, and the smoke was coming off them, but it did create the heat in a misty atmosphere or a foggy one to lift it that much that you could get in underneath it. You had that sinking feeling as you were approaching and you were holding the aircraft back and you're losing airspeed, and you got that moment of stillness before you hit the runway, and the first thing was the bump and the screech of the tires. I don't know whether the screech was the tires or everybody going, ah, you know, at the last minute, we're here.
In Germany, men and machines were mobilized to combat the bomber offensive. By early 1944, the Germans had night fighters that dominated the skies, causing terrible damage to the British squadrons. In one raid on Nuremberg, 108 bombers were shot down. Increasingly sophisticated radar installations, searchlights, flares, and over 30,000 anti-aircraft guns meant night no longer offered the bomber protection. The British offensive faltered. Only with Allied air supremacy over German skies would it resume its momentum. When America joined the war in Europe, it created new air forces to take part in the bomber offensive against Germany. The American commanders put their faith in precision bombing, with the inherent risk of daylight operations. To begin with, their air crews were quite unprepared for the sort of battle they were getting into, as one of their commanders, Curtis LeMay, soon realized.
The pilots I had originally, they'd come right out of flying school, had about 200 hours on single-engine airplanes. The bombardiers I got 2 weeks before we went overseas. Navigators, half of them, the first time they saw an ocean, they navigated across it. The gunners had supposedly been to a gunnery school. They'd never shot a gun from an airplane. We never flew formation until we got to England. It was a complete debacle. They just couldn't do it.
The B-17, the Flying Fortress, was the bomber the United States relied on to fly in daylight, without fighter escort, deep into the German heartland. It carried half the bomb load of a Lancaster and cruised at an altitude of 25,000 feet. But it was heavily armored and heavily armed with 11 machine guns.
The B-17 was a very strongly built airplane. It had the old DC-3 engine in it. It had 4 of them. That engine had been around a while, been pretty thoroughly tested. And, you know, you had to take a direct hit in it to knock it out, or cut a fuel line or something of that kind. Now, the airplane was slightly underpowered, but it was a good engine. Easy to fly, very forgiving. It had a big, thick wing on it. I saw one torn off because the airplane was in steep dive, and the wind force tore it off. I never saw a wing blown off an airplane the whole war. These airplanes took lots of bullets and a lot of shrapnel and survived. We took a direct hit in the number 2 gas tank over Lille. It ended up with a hole that was probably 6 feet by 6 feet, completely through the wing. You could have dropped a desk completely through the wing of the airplane. The fire was so big, the tail gunner could not stay in the tail. It got so hot from the gasoline burning. And we couldn't feather the propeller. And yet we flew the airplane back and landed it with no trouble. We did not have enough guns on the airplane. We had a real problem in trying to defend ourselves in the sky. Even though we had the famous Flying Fort with a lot of machine guns, we didn't have enough. We learned right off, for instance, and the Germans learned this quickly, that we could not fire straight forward because the top turret guns could not come down below level, and the belly guns couldn't shoot up. So the front was open.
The Americans, like the Germans and British before them, suffered great casualties in daylight. But they endured their losses until finally the arrival of Allied long-range fighters brought them the protection they needed.
All of the men on the air crews were volunteers. Nobody could be assigned flying duty. They had to volunteer first. Many of us might have changed our minds had we had better foresight and had anticipated the flak, the fighters, some of the tougher raids like Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich.
We never knew any of the crews. To us, they were just planes going by in the morning on a mission. And we'd go outside the hangar, watch them go by. Once in a while, wave to one of the pilots, see if he'd wave back. I know I was saying a prayer, and I'm pretty sure the rest of them were saying it. They didn't say they were. But if you talk to them today, they were saying, yes, we did.
To protect his unescorted bombers, General Curtis LeMay introduced a new formation called the Combat Box. Aircraft were stacked and staggered in such a way that each bomber in the group was covered by the guns of every other one.
Flying at high altitude, particularly depending upon the humidity in the air, you would get contrails coming off the engine, the condensation of the exhaust. It was a beautiful sight to see, but it was a terrifying sight because it not only gave away your position to the gunners on the ground, but it also allowed the German fighters to fly up the contrail and attack you from the rear almost unannounced. Participated in one of the 1,000-plane raids and seen the number of airplanes in the sky at one time was just appalling. It was absolutely fantastic. There were planes all over the sky as far as you could see, wave after wave after wave of planes. The thing that to some degree I liken it to would be the movie The Birds. The inhabitants of the village looked up and the sky was black with birds. And I guess that's kind of what it looked like, literally a sky full of planes.
Anti-aircraft is scary looking. When the shells explode right near your aircraft, you can hear the fine shrapnel hitting the airplane. And it's just like hail on a tin roof. The next 3 shots is going to be right with you, maybe into Bombay. Seeing it explode, and they had different colors. They had red and green, and they had some purple. And that stuff is scary looking, and I was scared. No question about it. You see ACAC going off just outside your window. You don't see people on the ground, but somebody shot that ACAC up there. So you really don't see people. You divorce yourself from it. It's what you do.
Well, it'd be a plane out there with an engine burning or something, and be 2 or 3 German fighters. They just come in on it and just riddle it to pieces. The German fighters would normally attack the full group. They didn't wait for cripples, but if there was a cripple in the area, he was really fair game.
B-17, right next to him, got a shell. The first time I'd seen one go down, and it spun off to the left. And parachutes began to come out of it. 1, 2, 3. You're counting. You're trying to count to 9. And everybody's counting, but you don't realize it. You think you're the only guy counting. And as the parachutes came out, you count them off as safe, safe, safe.
You have to pay an admission price every time you go over there. You're going in enemy territory to destroy some of his resources. Now, he's going to try to prevent you, and you're going to have some losses. If you're going to pay an admission price, you better get something for it. You better hit the target. Now, if you miss the target and you have to go back again, The admission price is about double what you paid the first time. And this is what happened to us a lot of times.
11,000 American bombers flew against the Germans. Almost half failed to return.
Some of the planes that came back really shook the crews up in the hangar. We didn't know any of the men, but we more or less could feel what they'd gone through. What we didn't expect was to get into a plane and maybe have to clean up the blood of some poor pilot that got shot up, or find pieces of clothing. Once in a great while, you might find a little piece of a body. And probably it maybe affected us a little more because we didn't know who it was. If we'd have known the people in there, maybe we knew what the man was like or something like that. Maybe we could have got away with it that way. But this way, all we know it was some American that had been in there.
All I can say is losing a friend was the hardest part of this war. And I've lost a few, I'll be honest with you, because we were really close. A combat crew couldn't be any closer than a husband and wife, and, well, I just don't want to think about it, okay?
The price paid in the lives of the air crews for the Allied bomber offensive was enormous. The RAF lost more than 55,000 men, 1 in 7 of all British Empire deaths in action. American losses in the European theater were greater still, 94,000 men. The cost to Germany was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands dead and the ruin of its cities.
At Hamburg, it was just unbelievable, the amount of smoke, the amount of flame. We flew by Hamburg about 3 days after the major part of the raid, and the smoke trails were as far as you could see, and the fires were still burning. We had 3 targets in Hamburg and couldn't find any of them because of the smoke and the fire.
The day after the armistice, they allowed us to come down to 600 feet and just look. Ordinarily on a mission, you're at 24,000 feet, and you don't see much. But at 600 feet, it's different. The city was totally devastated. There were no streets. I mean, you couldn't find streets. And all the bricks and the buildings had just caved into the street. And it'll always remain in my mind.
You knew that the civilians couldn't survive. Then again, we weren't that concerned about them because they were the enemy.
So what did the bombing offensive in Europe achieve? Not as much as its champions had first thought it might. The bomber did not defeat Germany on its own. It did not break the morale of the German people. But it did divert resources to air defense from other hard-pressed fronts. It kept many of the Luftwaffe's fighters tied to their home bases. Perhaps most important of all, for a long period, it was the only way the Western Allies had of hitting back at Germany. In the war in the Pacific, American bombers faced a different problem. Until 1944, Japan lay beyond their reach. It was too far, even from the airstrips hastily dug out of the desolate terrain of the Aleutians, the strip of islands stretching across the northern Pacific. But then came the capture of islands closer to Japan, like the Marianas, and at last a major bombing offensive could begin. Key to this air assault was a brand new bomber, the B-29, the Super Fortress. The biggest and most advanced bomber of the war, it was fast, over 350 miles an hour, and with its pressurized cabin could fly at heights well above the flak. It was well armed and had 5 gun turrets, 2 on top of the fuselage, 2 on the bottom and 1 in the rear. But above all, with its range of over 3,000 miles, here at last was a bomber that could hit Japan. At the start of the offensive, the Superfortress used the same tactics employed in Europe. They flew unescorted by fighters. But cloud cover, common over Japan, obscured their targets and limited the damage they could inflict. Once again, the losses were appalling. Each mission was losing 6% of its planes. Statistically, no aircrew could expect to survive a tour of 25 sorties. Then General LeMay arrived from Europe. He ordered a change of tactics. Now it would be incendiaries instead of high explosives. Lower-level runs in place of high-altitude raids. Within months, the new policy had paid off. First Tokyo in a devastating firestorm, then other major Japanese cities were reduced to cinders and rubble. Soon the Superfortress could roam at will across the Japanese skies, systematically destroying the country's industrial base. By mid-1945, strategic bombing had brought Japan to its knees. Now it was a couple of B-29s that would deliver the knockout blow. On August the 6th, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay, after the captain's mother, took off from the Mariana Islands. Its target, Hiroshima. Its mission, to drop an atomic bomb. The explosion was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. It destroyed the city's center, killing 78,000 people in its blast. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. It was the ultimate in terror bombing. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. For the United States Air Force chiefs, the lessons of the war were clear. Bombing worked, and they now had a monopoly of nuclear weapons. They also had another new bomber, one that could take off from America and reach targets a continent away. The B-36, a monster of an aeroplane with 6 piston and 4 jet engines.
Prove this is engineer. For pressurized. You don't smell the gas fumes. It's okay to smoke.
Inside the aircraft, there was comfort and space undreamed of by the aircrews of World War II. Here was a unique opportunity. The air chiefs seized it. They set up an independent bomber force, SAC, the Strategic Air Command. General LeMay was put in charge of this new air force, whose job was to deter aggression with the threat of mass destruction. But the general was not happy with the state of his new command, so he put it to the test under wartime conditions.
Not one airplane in the Strategic Air Command finished its mission as briefed. They had absolutely no combat capability. Zero.
So LeMay developed the concept of a peacetime air force on a wartime footing. its bombers armed and ready for action at all times.
Brakes are set, battery on, interphone's on, stand by to start engine. Clear left, hit him.
The bomber that carries out this mission for the Strategic Air Command is the B-52, a plane that has already had an operational life of over 30 years.
The B-52 has been around for a long time. It was a magnificent airplane back in the 50s when it came out. We were in awe of it. I think we're a little less in awe of it, but it's still a magnificent airplane.
The first time I walked up to one, it did seem almost too big to fly. I have to admit that there are times during flight I look out at the wings when we're just cruising along, and I really do wonder what keeps it up there.
Over the years, we've shored up the wings, we've improved its engines, we have improved its avionics capability immeasurably. We have kept it flying, and it's served us well.
The B-52 was the aeroplane that dropped the first hydrogen bomb on Bikini Atoll in 1956. Its only active service was in Vietnam. Here it came up against defended targets. Even with the United States in control of the skies, this bomber, like its predecessors, was found to be vulnerable. The new threat was missiles.
When we started using it in and around Hanoi in December of 1972, we had to accept some losses. And that, of course, showed to us that at high altitude, in a surface-to-air missile defended area, that we were going to be taking some hits or some losses and losing some aircraft.
That's why this has been built, the B-1, the U.S. Air Force's answer to the challenge to find a bomber that can penetrate the enemy's defenses. It's the most expensive bomber ever produced. Expensive because of its state-of-the-art avionics. 2 tons of electronics to jam the enemy's radar. Yet more to find the target. No wonder 2 of its 4 crew members are electronic systems operators. 8 nuclear missiles or 84 conventional bombs are its payload. Its shape is designed to reduce its visibility to radar. The B-1 can fly at 600 miles an hour, 200 feet above the ground. The ultimate strategic bomber. It has a daunting and difficult task, even if all the sophisticated electronics work. Many people, remembering previous bombers, think it can't be done. That is why the Strategic Air Command is holding on to its B-52s till the end of the century. The bomber has changed the face of war. It has made every street and village a front line. It has wrought mass destruction on an unparalleled scale. It has not, despite the claims of its early champions, won wars on its own. But so awesome is its power, it remains a most formidable weapon to have on your side.
Nicely worked out shot, that. Played the pot, but knew if he caught the bump in the middle pocket, the cue ball would be coming down towards the black. John Parrett's got to be careful here. 32 points in front, but the reds are quite nicely spread, so he's got to be careful.
Yes, you also have to be lucky, and he has been there.
The faster is recounted in Reaching for the Skies.
Ever since man first flew, he has been driven to build faster and faster aeroplanes. The SR-71 Blackbird flies at 3 times the speed of sound, faster than a rifle bullet. Another milestone in the quest for speed. Speed has always held a fascination for man. The desire to beat the latest record has led to all kinds of technical progress, especially in aviation.
Contact. Contact. Contact.
In 1909, this Curtiss Pusher was the fastest aeroplane in the world. Glenn Curtiss had built and raced motorcycles in his craving for speed. He built the 60-horsepower Pusher to compete in the Gordon Bennett Trophy race at the world's first air show at Reims in France. Curtiss was the only American there, and he started as the underdog, arriving just in time to take part. The Gordon Bennett Trophy was by far the most coveted prize of the meet. Francis Louis Blériot was the favorite in his monoplane, fresh from his triumphant crossing of the English Channel. The spectators were treated to a thrilling race. The result was in the balance right up to the closing stages. Curtiss beat Blériot by 6 seconds, setting the first speed record for aeroplanes at 46.5 miles an hour. Dale Kreitz was 4 at the time, and at 83 still flies his Curtiss Pusher in the skies over Wisconsin.
You had all the apprehensions of what can happen, of course, when you're up there, whether this engine will keep on going. It could stop firing anytime, and then you are looking for a place to land. You work more flying a Curtiss pusher in the 10 minutes than you flying all day in a normal airplane, because the airplane has no stability whatsoever, because the air currents are rising faster than the airplane moves forward. They always said they flew the darn things when the dew is on the grass in the morning and the mosquitoes are out at night. So that eliminated these thermals that give you a bump. All of a sudden you feel like you're in an elevator. You're just sitting there floating along in the air with nothing under you, and you just feel like you're accomplishing something out of this world. It's what Curtiss said at one time, I'd fly for the mere sport of it if I wasn't in the business, because there's a fascination about flying that's difficult to explain and hard to resist. And that's just about what flying is.
The air meet at Reims created enormous interest in aviation. Racing was clearly a money spinner. Cities across Europe and America put up ever bigger prizes to attract the aviators. The top competitive pilots, like Louis Paulhan and Jean Conneau of France and Claude Graham-White from England, became stars and earned fortunes. Admirers turned up at races just to catch a glimpse of them. Death only added more drama to the occasions. On the first circuit of Europe race, 3 pilots died in one day, and the French cabinet minister was accidentally killed when the crowd pushed him in front of a propeller. But closeness to danger only drew bigger crowds and attracted more pilots with a will to win. The speed of aircraft moved steadily upwards. To make them faster, designers improved their machines. The maze of struts and wire of the pusher biplanes gave way to the sleeker monoplanes. By 1911, Edward Newport in a monoplane had raised the record to over 80 miles an hour. By 1913, it had reached 126 miles an hour. The French were the most advanced nation in aviation. They took pride in the achievements of their pilots. At the heart of that success was a revolutionary new engine. Many early aircraft had water-cooled engines, which were heavy and tended to overheat. French engineers hit on the idea of making the engine spin with the propeller, cooling itself in the process, and also reducing weight. The result was the rotary engine, which powered most record-breaking aircraft of the day, and many others, like the British Avro 504. Air racing had shown its value as a proving ground. And when Europe turned to war in 1914, rotary engines based on the French design powered a generation of fighters, like the Sopwith Pup. On the racing circuit, one event, more than any other, came to symbolize the quest for speed. It started at Monaco in 1913. Jacques Schneider, the French Undersecretary for Air, wanted to promote the design of seaplanes. He donated a magnificent trophy for which international teams would compete. After the war, the Schneider Cup became the most coveted prize in aviation. Italy won it in 1920, 21, and Britain in 1922. Then the Americans sent a team of Navy pilots who swept the board, the winner reaching 181 miles an hour. The secret lay in their new Curtiss D-12 engines, which could be cooled by water even at very high power. In 1925, an American Army pilot, James Doolittle, won the trophy. Then the United States government withdrew financial support, leaving the Schneider Cup to the Europeans. The British came up with a new contender, the Supermarine S5, a new monoplane racer designed by R.J. Mitchell.
The wings were thinner and therefore had to be braced. And it was braced all over, almost like a bird cage. We apprentices, who reckoned we knew more than our bosses, looked at that and said, what are all those wires on it? We thought that was all wrong. And then I went to see it on Slipway, and I was highly impressed. Here was this beautiful aeroplane, streamlined, slim. To me, the perfect aeroplane that existed.
Once again, it was engine power which counted.
The sound of the engines was marvelous, of course. Especially on the turns when they came down off the glide with the full power. It really was something that made your blood tingle.
That was very, very thrilling and exciting. You could see this little dot buzzing along, and the noise of the engine, which was a great roar, came very much reflected off the water, of course, across the Solent. And you could see the airplane was at least half a mile ahead of the sound.
The 1927 race was held in Venice between the Italians and the British. Both teams had new aircraft. The Italian M52s gradually dropped out with engine problems, leaving two S5s to romp home. Flight Lieutenant Webster won at 281 miles an hour. Webster returned to his hometown of Walsall to a hero's welcome. Once again, the search for more speed lay in more power. Rolls-Royce took up the challenge. Their R series of engines had many of the features of America's D12, but they now produce nearly 2,000 horsepower.
These engines were really just made for the racing to start with. They found the engine worked fine for 20 minutes or half an hour, but of course that wasn't good enough. We wanted a bit more than that. And eventually they managed to produce at least an hour and a half absolute reliability.
The new S6 racers with the R engines were only just ready in 1929. If Britain could win 2 more races, it could keep the Schneider Cup forever. A national will developed to do so.
People came from all over the place. There were huge crowds on all the beaches, and it was a very exciting business. The amount of technology that went into those airplanes was tremendous. I mean, they really were touching on the sort of limits of aviation possibility.
Britain won the 1929 race. And in 1931, John Boothman ended the saga of the Schneider Cup by winning it outright. Then George Stainforth broke the world speed record at 407 miles an hour. With the end of the Schneider Cup, much of the competitiveness went out of air racing in Europe. But in America, the combination of high speeds and low flying was turned into a spectator sport, the National Air Races. They were a potent mixture of spectacle and danger for the crowd, and cash, glamour, and glittering prizes for the pilots. Today, the races are held at Reno, Nevada. Many of the aircraft are fighters dating from the Second World War, and racing them is expensive and a labor of love for the pilots. But winning remains the objective. and the setting is openly gladiatorial. While the crowds wait for the racing to start, the organizers entertain them with stunt flying and razzmatazz. The scene has barely changed in half a century. However daring the barnstormers, the main attraction was always the mass takeoff for closed-circuit races like the Thompson Trophy. The pilots were dedicated to the quest for speed, but they were a different breed from the military men of the Schneider Cup. They were self-sufficient types, adventurers, garage mechanics and showmen operating on a shoestring. And one of them, Benny Howard, built his first aircraft to carry bootleg whiskey. And racing was not confined to men.
Congratulations, sweetheart. You set a new world record.
Well, thank you. It seems good to be down on the ground again. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Well, how'd it go anyway?
Mary Hazlett was one of the top racing pilots of her day.
I'm very glad to have been able to increase the women's speed record in my Riddell Williams racer from 210 miles an hour to a little over 255. And I hope that I'll live a long time to go farther and faster.
For women, there were the powder puff races.
I think the powder puff derby was a misnomer. There was certainly nothing powder puff about it. As a matter of fact, a girl was killed in the first one. We were a different breed. I won't say we were a better breed, but we were different. I suppose it required a certain amount of perhaps foolhardiness, disregard of one's own skin. I wouldn't call it courage. This was just something that I always wanted to do. I loved it, and I suppose I would be flying now, except there are very little demands for the services of an elderly lady test pilot.
Engine power remains the hallmark of a racing aircraft.
This is like the world's greatest flying museum. You know, you go to a wonderful museum and it's like having stuffed dogs. I mean, they don't bark, they don't eat. But when you come out here, you know, these Hummers work. And they're going to work like you'll never see them work anywhere else. You can grab a hold of an airplane here and literally take your life in both hands. One for the throttle and one for the stick, and you can control your own destiny free of most rules and regulations. Well, it may not be better than your wedding night, but it's probably better than the second one. You know, adrenaline is a naturally induced narcotic, but it's stronger than most narcotics. And once you get it moving around in there, I mean, it's a rush that's hard to describe. And you get it when you get this puppy moving.
The grandstands used to be packed. It was standing room only. But I think it was partly the same motivation that the Roman crowds had to come and see the Christians torn up by the lions. Partly a macabre feeling that if they stayed long enough, there was going to be a disaster. And there always was.
The cost in lives was high, but there were always new pilots waiting to race. To stay competitive, safety was often compromised for speed. The tiny GB racer was nearly all engine, and it was very difficult to handle. One pilot who flew it was the Schneider winner, Jimmy Doolittle.
If you take an airplane up in the air and just set everything just right, the airplane will fly itself. The unique thing about the GB is that if you took it up in the air, no matter what you did, if you let go of it, it took over, and apparently in an effort to destroy itself, you with it.
But the GB was fast. In 1931, Lowell Bales, a racing pilot, took one to challenge the speed record for land planes held by the French at 278 miles an hour. On his first attempt, he reached 281 miles an hour, but was denied the official record because the margin was not large enough. So he went out again. This time, he reached 300 miles an hour. Bales was killed instantly. The following year, Jimmy Doolittle did break the record in a GB. He retired from racing shortly afterwards. Only 3 were ever built, and both the others crashed, killing their pilots.
Aviation wouldn't be where it is today if it hadn't been for the early flying. Racing advanced the design of the airplanes. The owners were constantly trying to make them safer, make them faster, perhaps make them faster rather than safer. I think their place in history is well earned.
In the Battle of Britain in 1940, Hitler received his first real setback at the hands of the Royal Air Force. Victory was based on 2 British fighters, the Hurricane and the Spitfire. Of the 2, the Spitfire was the faster. The Spitfire was the direct descendant of the last Schneider Cup winners. Designed by the same man, R.J. Mitchell, its Merlin engine was derived from the racing engines built by Rolls-Royce over a decade earlier. Flying the Spitfire was a joy for its test pilots.
I would describe the Spitfire certainly as what you might call a sports aeroplane. It was tremendously exciting. I mean, I was only 24 at the time, and so I thought, well, you know, that's exactly the sort of airplane everybody wanted to fly. And it was a pilot's airplane. I mean, all the subsequent pilots who flew it, they all loved it. The prototype Spitfire had a fixed-pitch, twin-bladed propeller, a very coarse pitch. So takeoff was very sluggish. So it wasn't anything like the sort of brisk takeoff that we had eventually when we had constant speed propellers. Nearly all previous fighters in the Air Force had been air-cooled, and they therefore had rather large, bulbous engines. The Spitfire, with its 12-cylinder inline engine, it had a beautiful, long, sort of sleek nose, and as an airplane, it had the look of a thoroughbred about it.
Germany had comparable piston-engine fighters, but the Luftwaffe was experimenting with new forms of propulsion. The Messerschmitt 163 had revolutionary features: rocket power, swept-back wings, and no tail. A new shape designed purely for speed. There was no room in the wings for a retractable undercarriage, so the wheels were designed to fall away after takeoff. Its fuel was a volatile cocktail of hydrogen peroxide, hydrazine hydrate, methyl alcohol, and water. Pilots had to be protected against the fuel, which would dissolve them. The aircraft was tricky to handle, and new pilots had yet another problem. There were no two-seat training versions, so their first flight had to be made alone. The rocket plane was so secret that seeing it for the first time came as quite a shock to its pilots.
Nachdem man mich in die Halle geführt hat,
after I had been taken into the hangar and had seen the bird, I was very excited. It was simply a winged plane driven by a rocket. The exhaust was roughly a little longer than a sewing machine.
es konnten zwei Mann das
2 men could lift the motor in and out, but the power was enormous.
Die Leistung war enorm. Sie leistet
The thrust of the rocket motor was approximately 1,700 kilos. That was around 6,000 horsepower, a power not available to fighter aircraft up until that time.
Test pilots like Hannah Reich learned to love the plane.
And I can only tell you, it was fascinating. It was like thundering through the skies, sitting on a cannonball, like being intoxicated by speed. It was only an overwhelming impression. At the end of the airfield boundary, you already reached about 500 miles per hour, and with constant speed, you were climbing up in 1.5 to 2 minutes into a height of 30,000 feet.
The concept was quite unique. 163 was an electrifying aircraft because it had this startling rate of climb. Normal fighters had a rate of climb of about 3,000 feet a minute. The 163 was climbing at 14,000 feet a minute initially. But of course, on the other side of the balance was the fact that it had very limited endurance. And indeed, if the throttle was held at full power on the rocket, it only had 3 minutes.
In the closing stages of the war, the Messerschmitt 163 was used to intercept Allied bombers. Its scoring rate was disappointing, but it startled Allied crews.
2 of them hit us. Actually, they appeared like a bat with the white exhaust coming out, and all of a sudden they turned and it came down vertically, and I realized that that was something different. And for a moment I was wondering, is this the secret weapon that Hitler's always saying he's going to hit us with? They just amazed us because they could outmaneuver and outrun any airplane that we had at the time.
Pilots had to make their final approach without engine power.
Their landing was done on a skid. It was dangerous to land with any fuel aboard. And they had a lot of accidents. In fact, 80% of their losses were on takeoff or landing.
On one occasion, Hannah Reich had to land with the wheels still attached.
I had to come to approach the airfield in a greater height as normally, but this destroyed the whole airflow because it was only wing without tail plane. it came out of control and crashed in a field and was completely demolished, and my head came to an instrument, and I suffered, my nose was, I have an artificial nose, and it's quadruple of fractured head and vertebra broken and many things. So after having been 5 months hospitalized, I was well again, spurred on by the only burning wish to continue as test pilot again.
Test flying was often just as hazardous with another new propulsion system, the jet engine. The jet was to open up a new era in the quest for speed. Germany was the first country to have jet-powered aircraft flying, but the creator of the jet engine was a young Royal Air Force officer, Frank Whittle. He patented the engine in 1930, but the British Air Ministry was slow to see the possibilities. He was kept starved of resources, and progress was painfully slow. His counterpart in Germany freely acknowledges Whittle's lead.
If the Air Ministry would not have denied support to Sir Frank, he could have brought to work a jet engine at least 4 years earlier. That would have been a deterrent for Hitler to go into Poland and risk a war with England and France.
Hans von Ohain worked for Heinkel. By 1941, they were building a prototype fighter, the 280. Messerschmitt was building another. The German Air Ministry was more supportive of new ideas than its British counterpart, but there was skepticism about jet propulsion in Germany too. Even the commander of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, was slow to appreciate its value.
They thought, these are Heinkel's play toys, which have no future. Also, the imagination of the war would be very short, and in that time it would be won by normal piston engines.
The Heinkel was ready first and flying at over 500 miles an hour. But it was the rival Messerschmitt, the 262, with its longer endurance, which went into mass production as a fighter. Pilots finally got their hands on it late in 1944.
For me, it was all sunshine. I felt like an emperor. When I was in a 109 together with 10 Mosquitoes, then I had no chance. But with the 262, I was laughing. I took off, left the Mosquitoes and the Mustangs standing. Naturally, the disadvantages showed up on operations. It was difficult for us to find a good position from which to shoot at the opponent, because the difference in speed could not be reduced. And so it often happened that we flew right past opponents without having a chance to shoot at them, simply because we were too fast.
Without any question, the Me-262 was the most formidable aircraft of World War II. Really, it looked rather like a shark. It looked ferocious and yet exciting. Once it was airborne, it was in a class of its own.
Group Captain Eric Brown flew captured 262s after the war.
Their jet engines had, to the best of our knowledge, a scrap life of 25 hours. Because at that stage of development, of course, the German engines were very shaky. And, of course, without documentation, there was always that slightly nervous feeling that you were perhaps flying a jet engine with 24 hours and 50 minutes on it.
But the Germans, having lost command of the skies, took a more realistic view.
Why should the engine live forever when the pilot would be killed with the airplane in combat much sooner?
At over 600 miles an hour, Messerschmitt's rocket-powered 163 and jet-powered 262 were the fastest aircraft of the war. In Britain, war had jolted the Air Ministry into action. The first flight of a British jet came in 1941, the experimental E-2839. By the summer of 1944, the first Gloucester Meteor jet fighters were in squadron service. The Meteor was slower than the German aircraft, but in 1945, one of them set a new official speed record of 606 miles an hour. Whittle's engine was more powerful and more reliable than those in Germany, and there was great hope in the country for its future.
To the birthplace of the jet are coming students from all the world to take their first peep at this child of Britain's brains. Today, man, power and money on a national scale are flowing into its development. For in this latest wonder of applied science, Britain sees a source of her future wealth and welfare.
But after the war, a new fight began.
We suddenly found ourselves competitive with our allies because the enemy had evaporated. And it became a race, quite frankly, between the Americans and ourselves to be the first to break the sound barrier, which was the big goal in those days. The sound barrier, of course, presented a tremendous challenge to both scientists and pilots. To scientists, it was something like akin to splitting the atom. To pilots, it was rather like climbing Mount Everest because the goal was tremendously prestigious.
Frank Whittle had started on an engine to power a supersonic aircraft during the war. By injecting extra fuel directly into the jet pipe, he increased its power. It was developed in great secrecy for the experimental Miles M52. But once again, Whittle's hopes were dashed.
Everything was going well. The aeroplane was almost complete. The power plant was virtually complete. Then the ministry cancelled the project. And the reason they gave was that it was too dangerous to risk a pilot in a supersonic aeroplane. It burns me up to think of the way we gave away the lead in supersonic flight. I'm confident that had the M52 reached completion, we would have been the first to fly supersonically.
The British government now put its faith in a new high-speed research aircraft from the de Havilland Company, the DH-108, the Swallow. Its tailless, swept-wing design owed a lot to captured German aircraft. Its purpose was to explore flying at close to the speed of sound, where pilots fought for control against buffeting and turbulence. On a test flight over the Thames estuary, the DH-108 broke up in midair, killing Geoffrey de Havilland's eldest son. Meanwhile, America was ready with a radically new research aircraft. The Bell X-1 was rocket-powered, and its design was based on the shape of a heavy-caliber bullet. The pilot was Captain Charles Chuck Yeager.
And I remember Colonel Boyd, our boss at Flight Test, coming out here to Muroc and saying, hey, we're not going to hurt anybody. And he cited as an example of the DH-108 killing a couple of pilots. And so the British stopped all research and development in the high Mach region. And it hurt them badly even today. And consequently, he didn't want the U.S. Air Force to get into that position.
The rocket fuel only lasted a short time, so the X-1 was carried aloft in the bomb bay of a B-29.
No airplane had ever flown much above 90% of the speed of sound until we got the X-1 up there. And consequently, every flight that we made, we were in a region where no one had ever had an airplane before. Basically, flight testing in the old days, we didn't have wind tunnel data. We didn't have simulators or computer technology. Today, you have all three, so consequently, you can let the test pilot fly the simulator, so when he flies a new airplane, he's an old hand in the airplane. In the old days, it was trial and error.
On the 14th of October 1947, Chuck Yeager flew faster than sound.
We realized, even when we started with the X-1, that the so-called sound barrier really restricted us from going any faster. And once we got the X-1 above the speed of sound, then, hey, this opens up the whole universe for us.
A year later in Britain, John Derry took a DH-108 through the sound barrier. Speed still attracted a crowd. The Farnborough Air Show of 1952 was packed to watch Derry fly supersonically in a new de Havilland fighter, the DH-110.
He took off, and we knew he was going to break the sound barrier, and he went up into the sky very high. It disappeared, and then it came back as a very, very